The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In our last episode of Challenge 2.0, we joined in conversation with members of the LGBTQ community. Our goal was to learn their stories, their insights, their challenges. We continue that conversation this week to learn how to become better allies for our family members, coworkers, neighbors, and friends who belong to that community. Thank you for joining us again, and we look forward to our conversation, which is a continuation, as we mentioned in the introduction of last week. I would like to begin by introducing Pastor Rick Pribenow, who is both the chaplain and the executive director of Open Door Ministries, a ministry of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Thank you very much for joining us again, Rick, and you're going to give us more of an overview very shortly of exactly what that ministry is involved with. I'd also like to introduce four members of what could best be described as the Speakers Bureau for Open Door, as either members of the LGBTQ community or as being supportive of that community. And so we thank Tom and Ellie, Elizabeth, Beth, and Spencer for joining us on this program today. Thank you so much. I might turn back to Pastor Rick. And Rick, give us a little bit of an overview, if you would, of your ministry and how you came to be involved with it and what it does.
So Open Door Ministry is basically about 27 years old, and the bishop at that time was asked to do a memorial service for a young man who had AIDS and had passed away. And the bishop, Lowell Knutson, said, well, why aren't you having your pastor do this? And the mother and father said, oh, we haven't been back to the church ever since the pastor told us that this is God's punishment on our son. Sip.
Yeah. And a gulp, too, I would say.
And so at that point, he did the service, and he, as bishop, went to the minister and said, you will be hosting the service. You will apologize to the family, and you will never make that kind of statement again. Well, at that period of time, Open Door was formed. I was shocked and surprised that they were going to hire me. And I said, why did you do that? And they said, because you were the only one during the interviews that would tell stories. You were the only person who shared their personal life. Everybody else was talking about concepts. Stories are what bring about change in a person's life. And so that's why we have our Speakers Bureau, because when they go out and share at a church, it helps that church to be able to consider the possibility of being more welcoming and inclusive.
So Spencer and Beth, I would ask you maybe just to give us a brief overview of how you came to become involved in this ministry and in reaching out to other people in your faith communities and the community as a whole.
So as a cis bisexual man, once I kind of made the realization, accepted that about myself. I'd been a lifelong Christian at that point, since childhood all the way up until post college, when I made that self realization, and after learning more both about myself and just in general, because there's just a lot to take in at that point. I was still, faith was at that point, and it still is very important to me. And so I really wanted to be utilize both my own identity as well as my faith, and at the same time, you use both of them at the same time. Use may be not the correct word, but for so much of my life, it was like those things were incompatible, and that's what I was told, and I didn't believe that, and so Open Door was one of the ways I want was an already existing way. The organization had existed before I joined, and so I figured, hey, this is a way I can help out. I can be bisexual, and Christian, and participate in helping others in that, because the church has a lot to make up for, a lot to apologize for, a lot to fix. Then that's on us, and so I wanted to be a part of that.
Beth, what drew you to your involvement?
So, as a straight cis female in the Lutheran Church, I grew up in the Lutheran Church my whole life, but then in the late 80s or late 90s, pardon me, I actually left the Lutheran Church for a time, primarily because of their stance on LGBTQ issues. And I started to attend the Episcopal Church in Seattle, the St. Mark's Cathedral, which had a much more liberal stance on most everything. Because I had always been very involved with gay rights, even when I was in high school, and I was involved in ACT UP and Chicken Soup Brigade in Seattle during the early days of the AIDS epidemic. And so it always struck me as an odd incompatibility, as Spencer said, that my personal life and my spiritual life didn't gel, and that I had rules in my spiritual life that didn't actually apply to the rules that I put out in my personal life. But then I went back to the Lutheran Church after my mother moved in with us after my father passed away, and it seemed odd to be going. She was still going to the Lutheran Church. She started to attend where my brother attends, and then I was going to a different church every Sunday, and it was kind of that old cliche of America is never more divided than on Sunday mornings, and that was happening within my own household. So we went back to St. Andrew's in Bellevue, and I just kind of slowly became involved again, and a little bit ignored the fact that they weren't dealing with this issue. It just wasn't spoken to, like Tom was saying. It's just not something that you talked about. And the church, like a lot of churches nowadays and a lot of Lutheran churches, the majority of the membership is older, like retired. And so there wasn't even language to speak about it, really. And there wasn't a way. So I just kind of kept quiet. And then this year we got a new pastor. We called a new pastor. Our pastor of 35 years retired, and we called a new pastor. And part of that call process, part of that hiring process, that interview process, the candidates were asked, are you open to this? And I wasn't on the call committee. I had nothing to do with it. But it was one of the topics that came up repeatedly in interviews, because that's what the congregation wanted. The congregation was asked, we were given all kinds of surveys, and what kind of questions do you want the committee to ask? And that topic kept coming up. And I admit, I put that question out in several surveys. And we were fortunate enough that the woman we called is very open. And I, to be honest, didn't even know about RIC until she approached me and said, would you please be on this committee? We want to put together a group of people to study this and examine this. And she gave me Rick's name. And I didn't even know there was a process to do this. I just thought some people are going to accept and some people aren't. But I did know that we had members in our congregation who had left or were treated badly because they had children who had come out or were transitioning or whatever it was, and they didn't feel supported and they didn't feel loved. And that's the last thing you want from a church, is to not feel loved. And our mission statement for our church is growing in Christ together to love and serve all people. And so this year, not just with LGBTQ issues, but also with racial issues, we're really putting an emphasis on the all people, that if we're going to say that, you have to do that. And so that we're in that process now. We have a racial equity committee, And then we have the LGBTQ inclusion committee. And like COVID, it's slowing everything down. We can only meet online in Zoom. It's a difficult conversation to have anyway. It's difficult to have over Zoom, but we're making it happen. We're just putting the information out there over and over again. And it's moving at glacial speed, which for God's frozen chosen, as the Lutherans call themselves, it's probably the right speed. So, but I think we're going to get there. I'm optimistic. We do have young people in our congregation who are just rolling their eyes like, what took you so long? But I think we haven't had any pushback. I haven't had a single snotty email or anything. So I think a lot of our worst fears won't be realized. And I'm just, keeping my fingers crossed.
I might ask all of you, either by a formal presentation or another situation, is there an instance that most resonates with you where you say to yourself, boy, the fact that I was willing to discuss this and to share really made a difference for somebody else?
So probably the one that I can think of was a older woman. We had done a presentation, and at the end of the presentation, a gentleman stood up and said, well, I don't want queers and faggots in this church. And the older woman said, my son's name is Kenny. His name is not queer. His name is not faggot. It's Kenny. And sorry. And later she said, that was not something that was typical for me. But I determined that if I don't say something, nobody else will. And so it's learning to be allies, learning to go ahead and to stand up and say something when somebody else cracks a joke, makes a rude comment, excludes somebody, to go ahead and call that bullying, and that's not acceptable, especially within the church.
That brings up a couple of issues. And one is the term that we've heard of, I think, a lot this past year, especially in terms of the experience of Black Americans and various other groups. And that's the term of microaggression. A person might not say something consciously to be mean or to be unpleasant, but it certainly doesn't feel that way if you're on the receiving end of it. And I'm wondering if you could maybe share some examples of microaggressions that you've witnessed, been the brunt of, that you just like people to think twice of before they say or express those feelings. Anybody have examples of that you'd be willing to share with us?
I know that I know I'm speaking as an ally and an outsider to this, but my nephew is a transmasculine male. And even my family, it was difficult for all of us. Not the transitioning was what took us by surprise, not the sexuality issues at all. Very fortunate to come from a family where who you love is not a problem. Who you vote for might be a problem, but who you love is not a problem. And but it was difficult even within our own family unit. Nobody wanted to see it as a microaggression, but using the improper name or the improper gender when speaking about him, and it almost became almost passive aggressive, where it was like, oh, I'm just making a mistake. I'm like, no, you're just, you're not trying. Like, it didn't seem intentional, but then after a while, it's like, you're only going to get a pass on forgetting for a little bit. And then you have to step up and you have to pay attention and realize what you're saying. And that when you're saying she and not he, or you're saying their previous name and not their chosen name, then it's a problem and it's hurtful, and we need to step up. And so even within families, it can happen and not, or if they'll say, oh, she, oh, whatever. And I'm like, no, it's not whatever. It matters, And so I've seen it. I haven't been on the brunt of it, but it's hurtful. I get defensive of him when that happens. Because I want him to be happy, and he's happy now. So
At first, I thought my siblings were supportive of me, but then, when they talked to my kids, they would use my old pronouns, and so then when my kids talked to me, they would use the old pronouns. I mean, I'm not their mom, so they still call me dad, but I would have liked for them to learn that say she's my dad. They're not there yet, but my oldest boy, we had a brief visit with our granddaughter and said, let's see your other grandma, referring to me. So that was the first time that the children had used me by using a correct pronoun from my perspective, because I was never a grandpa. I had transitioned essentially before I became a grandparent. My mom, took a while for my mom to use the correct pronoun, but she did. She wasn't happy when I transitioned. She said, "I don't know why anybody would want to be a woman," was her exact quote. But that's because of the way she grew up, and women couldn't own property. They couldn't do anything on their own. So there's different reasons for wanting to have been a man in her generation, and that you got you had certain economic power that you still don't have today, but it's a lot better today than it was then. And so she thought of it from that standpoint. But then but she never wanted to be a man. She just didn't know why I wanted to be a woman. Which eventually the first outfit I had, she said, no woman would dress like that. And because I told her, she says, I got to talk to you about this, and she said, you don't want to do this. She said, and that was her quote. No one dressed like that. A year or so go by, I wear the exact same outfit. She says, gee, you look really nice. So just because fortunately sometimes change can occur, and that was a positive example for me that did occur. She ended up getting dementia, and she couldn't remember the other children's name, but she remembered my name, my current name. So that was a blessing to me.
I think the other aspect of this that flows out, and I think, Rick, you used this term first, I'd like to explore, I think it might be useful to explore the concept of being an ally. For each of you, what does that mean? And where would that be, given your experiences, where would that be most useful? Tom, I might begin with you on that question first.
From my perspective, to me, being an ally kind of means making the other your neighbor, making that intentional step of thinking and internalizing people maybe very different from yourself, but as your neighbor who you want to love and be a part of their lives. And so to me, being an ally is something that enhances a person's life, because it brings to them whole new sets of people to be neighborly with.
Mm-hmm. Spencer, any perspectives on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think for me, ally, I view it in a similar frame as when we use the term racist. And the way I look at that is it's not like a state of being, like it's not who somebody is, right? I wouldn't say that somebody is an ally or somebody is a racist. It's the actions, right? It's the action. Someone is being racist, someone is being an ally, right? And so that's how I view it. And so because I think when we look at it as like trying to make it part of our identity in terms of like who we just are on a regular basis, I think when we try to internalize it, like I'm nice to them, so I'm an ally, that type of thing. I think what it creates complacency, because we're not looking at what we can do. We're just like, it's this idea of like, I want people to see me as an ally or see me as not racist. But I don't think that's the right frame. I think we need to see, what are you doing to be an ally? And so with that in mind, one of the big things I look for is kind of like being proactive. Because when I've talking to people in churches and talking to people, it's like people are very reactive and very receptive, right? In a lot of the churches I've been into and the conversations I've had with people, they've been very receptive. Like they haven't been, mean back, because like they've asked me to come speak. So typically they want to hear me speak. And so they're very reactive. So what I'm really looking for is for people to do these actions without me telling them, without me saying, oh, you should go look at these things. You should. I would love for them to tell me something, really, right? Like I would love for them to go take something on rather than saying, oh, like, why don't you come do this? It's like, well, I mean, I can do that, but like you could also do that. Now, obviously there's things you want to be, led by people, led by queer people, led by LGBTQ people. But there's other things where it's like, I don't have to be the one like holding a presentation of like the specifics on gender identity versus gender expression. Like if you know the material, anybody can give that. Obviously, like you want to make sure you're right, but that's kind of what I'm looking for, is that kind of proactivity, to do things without being told to do things. So whether that's standing up for somebody, whether that's educating others, whether that's you're the person going and talking to the pastor about things, that's what I'm looking for.
One of the topics that Rick will go through with our church when we're going through the process, a question I guess that comes up a lot with churches is, well, we are welcoming. How come we have to make a public statement that says we are welcoming? We love everybody. Of course we do. And it's like, no, well, one, you don't. And two, people aren't going to know you're welcoming just because you look like a nice person or there's a nice flag on your, reader board or something outside. That's not a statement. That's not an affirmation of statement. That's just I'm not saying anything mean does not mean that you're saying anything nice. So you're saying the right thing. And so it is very important to come out and say that you are affirming, you are accepting, and to make it public. And that way, from a practical standpoint, when people are searching for churches, they move, they want to find a new church home, they can look on your website and it says, you've done this work, you have been through this process, you have educated yourselves, and you know what this means, and they are truly going to be welcome and safe there. So I think that's very important. And I think even as small things, like I just haven't done it. I haven't thought about it, but like my daughter's really great about it, of like you saying like on your email signature, putting your personal pronouns that you prefer, because doing that normalizes it, so that when somebody who needs to do that because people might question it or they might mispronoun someone, that if cis straight people would do it, then it would just make it normal, to show this is a standard thing to do, and you shouldn't guess about somebody's gender, and you shouldn't guess about somebody's identity, and you shouldn't guess about somebody's orientation. You shouldn't have to, it shouldn't matter, but if you do it wrong, it's hurtful. And I don't want to, not only do I not want to be hurtful, I want to be helpful, and you got to do both. And I think, and it takes effort, and you have to educate yourself.
I mean, acceptance is the first part for me. But Spencer, was right on, in that they're being proactive. I had a contracting assignment at a local cell phone company that likes magenta as its color, and and they brought in a new diversity director. And the year I was contracting there, she got that company to score 100% on the Human Rights Commission equality score. And so to me, that's what an ally does. They go, if you're in a position of leadership, you make sure that everybody else is on board and you do what you need to do to cause that to happen.
Well, as I say, thank you, each of you, for being on this program, for sharing your experiences and your wisdom and perspectives. I think none of us will have left this set of two programs with quite the same attitude, quite the same orientation that we started out. For those of you that are tuning in right now, either on video or audio, I would invite you to stay tuned for the next 2 weeks of challenge. If you have certain assumptions in terms of what the major faith traditions say about LGBTQ individuals, their orientations, I think you're going to be in for a bit of a surprise, and it's going to be a very thought-provoking conversation. So again, thank you for joining us this week. Thank you to all of our panelists, and we hope you'll join us again next week on Challenge 2.0. Thank you very much. If you've enjoyed this program, found our conversations to be informative, entertaining, and thought-provoking, and the vision inspiring of people from different backgrounds who can disagree without being disagreeable, perhaps you might consider supporting our program with a contribution. Your support will not only help our program continue, it will also support the broader efforts of Paths to Understanding, our supporting parent nonprofit organization.